Before we get into all of that, or as a precursor to all of that, I want to talk about inquiry-based practice on the mat and as a constant unfolding in our lives. So it's my sense that inquiry-based spiritual practice is the kind of practice that is deeply supported and brought forth in Zen. This questioning into everything that we can question into, including our own nature, who we are, what we are. And I used to use the word truth to talk about that like I'm practicing Zen because I want to come in contact with truth. I want truth. But my relationship to that, I came to realize, is very much like truth is a thing or a place that I'm going to reach if I practice hard enough. That like I'm going to sit and then someday I'm going to reach the promised land of truth. And so now I'm actually just in my own self prefer the term honesty, because I think that evokes the kind of ongoing nature of like moment to moment, just how can I experience and express honesty, and or honestly. And so practice is aimed at experiencing and expressing what is most honest in any given moment. And that kind of questioning is not easy because it requires that we start to value what is true over what is comfortable or what we want. It really can reorient our whole life and our whole way of experiencing. And with that issue of like decentralization, it real questioning requires that we decentralize what we want and search for what is true instead. So one way of working with questions would be intellectually, and we use this vehicle of the thinking mind to travel along this linear path of logic to arrive at a sensible answer. And we do that all the time, and that's great that our minds can do that. It gives us, makes it really easy to answer questions like, choosing a tool to get a nail through a piece of wood. Like, we can look at what we've got, we can think through that logically, and we can make the best choice, whether or not we have a hammer around. But there's a danger, obviously, to assuming that our logical faculties are the only ones that matter, or that they're the most important. And that's a tendency of our culture, is to downgrade emotions, creativity, intuition, direct experience, empathy, and a space for our unconscious, for what we don't know, to come up. And when we do that, that's how we end up with, I read an article recently that says, that describes capitalism as an economic, political, and social system whose prime directive is to churn nature and humans into capital, and to do it more and more each year, regardless of the costs to human well-being and to the environment we depend on. And that I think that's a feature of valuing the logical mind over everything else. It allows us to just sacrifice anyone and anything on the altar of growth and wealth. And to me, that is counter to the Zen and the Buddhist experience of deep connection, of knowing ourselves not only as a part of a whole, but as the whole, that we cannot, I ask this question a lot of myself and other people, try to imagine being alone, actually existing out of relationship to everything else. It's impossible. Sometimes people will be like, well, you just take a spaceship to outer space. I'm like, well, that's just taking the Earth with you. That's like creating a micro-Earth, and just really knowing that there is no possibility for being separate from everything else. That we're in this thing together, and we better, and I don't want to shake my finger, but we better figure out how to do that. So there's the side where we put too much emphasis on logic, but I think it's also possible to put too much emphasis on the spiritual experience of answering that question, or answering any question. We ask a question like who am I, or what is this? And and I've seen, and I've in my own being experienced, and I've heard many stories about, finding this kind of blissful nihilism. And, when we get too stuck in the absolute, that everything is everything else, and there's, nothing to worry about, then we can find ourselves in really morally indefensible positions, saying things like, everything is as it should be, as our lifestyle enslaves people and places around the world, right? So finding something else that isn't so far into the logical, and then also isn't so far into the absolute that we lose sense of our experience as a human being in community with the human and more than human world. So the on the personal level, when we are questioning, a lot of the answers that we get to our questions are expressions of our conditioning. So we all experience our lives through this habituated sieve, right? I'm sure we're all aware that our upbringing, our culture, our personal history, our family, that all of that creates the way that we experience the world, the window that we look through. And that's not a problem. I mean, it's in and of itself. I don't think that we should be blank, unconditioned beings who only experience direct reality all the time. But with real deep inquiry practice, a thing that I think is really cool is that I could ask a question like, who am I? And the answer that comes up might be, well, I'm a woman. And there are different things I could do with that answer. I could say, okay, yeah, great, solved it. I know who I am. I could throw that out because that's not the deepest answer. I could say, well, there's more here, so I'm not going to look at that answer. Or I could actually use that as a jumping off point to exploring my conditioning and how to move past it, or how to decentralize it. So the answer, I am a woman, gives me information that I'm very comfortable with gender connected to identity. It tells me that my mind is, that it has a proclivity toward placing things into categories. It tells me that I use categorization to help me understand the world. And so those are all fine things, but when I know about them, when they aren't just the answer and then I have the answer, then there's room to explore, there's room to set that aside and say, okay, what else? And so there's lots and lots of layers to this, obviously. When we use the answers to our questions as jumping off points to feel into and move on from our conditioning. And as we get deeper into these layers, we can come into kind of an openness and an interest, so that we're less caught up. And I have come to feel that when I'm engaged in this kind of inquiry, or even I've just engaged in my life, that when there's a certain kind of hardness that I can start to connect into in my being, or a kind of stuckness that tells me that there's something there that I don't want to let go of, that I don't want to look at, that I want to believe is just the truth. And so I can actually try to orient my attention towards that as a point of interest, as a point of somewhere that I can work, rather than shrinking away from it. Because especially in this world where we live in a world of globalized, white supremacist, fossil fuel-based, extractivist capitalism that we buy into when we start to question that, it can get really uncomfortable, because it means that we have to give up things that are very, very luxurious, both internally and in our lives. If we start to question into that, a lot of hardness can start to come up in a lot of us. I know myself, because I don't want to think that the clothes that I buy are enslaving people across the world. I don't want to believe that when I drive my car more than I need to, that I'm helping to, release fossil fuels into the, or I guess, greenhouse emissions into the atmosphere. And so I know I'm like kind of beating the point a little bit, but that it's like, I read this quote recently, like, which is what brought this word decentralized so much into my mind, is woman was talking about cultural appropriation in spirituality, specifically in yoga, and she said something like we have got to decentralize our feelings when faced with accusations around racism, around injustice, and around entitlement. And it's like, yeah, you do. Like, I don't want to, but like, whether or not something makes me uncomfortable isn't the point. We can still, and that is so much a part of deep Zen practice too, not just this like, in the world, but also when we're on the mat, that those blocks that come up that are the most comfortable often, in my experience, are where the biggest releases come, and as we go deeper. So what does Buddhism tell us about what to do in this world? So first, Naomi Klein is like fantastic. She's great. I highly recommend this book. This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. And she just does a really good job. This is kind of a lengthy quote, but of explaining and making really clear the system that it is that we buy into. And then I'd like to turn to the precepts as a framework in which to like explore this. She says, so the carelessness at the core of this economic model, this carelessness is at the core of an economic model some political scientists call extractivism, a term originally used to describe economies based on removing ever more raw materials from the earth, usually to export to traditional colonial powers where value was added. And it's a habit of thought that goes a long way toward explaining why an economic model based on endless growth ever seemed viable in the first place. Though developed under capitalism, governments across the ideological spectrum now embrace this resource-depleting model as a road to development. And it is this logic that climate change calls profoundly into question. Extractivism is non-reciprocal. It's a dominance-based relationship with the earth, one of purely taking. It's the opposite of stewardship, which involves taking, but also taking care that regeneration and future life continue. Extractivism is the mentality of the mountaintop remover and the old-growth clear-cutter. It is the reduction of life into objects for the use of others, giving them no integrity or value of their own, turning living, complex ecosystems into natural resources, mountains into overburden, as the mining industry terms the forests, rocks, and streams that get in the way of its bulldozers. It is also reduction of human beings either into labor to be brutally extracted, pushed beyond limits, or alternatively, into social burden, problems to be locked out at borders, and locked away in prisons or reservations. In an extractivist economy, the interconnections among these various objectified components of life are ignored. The consequences of severing them are of no concern. Extractivism is also directly connected to the notion of sacrifice zones, places that to their extractors somehow don't count and therefore can be poisoned, drained, or otherwise destroyed for the supposed greater good of economic progress. This toxic idea has always been intimately tied to imperialism, with disposable peripheries being harnessed to feed a glittering center, and it is bound up, too, with notions of racial superiority, because in order to have sacrifice zones, you need people and cultures who count so little that they are considered deserving of sacrifice. Extractivism ran rampant under colonialism, because relating to the world as a frontier of conquest rather than as a home fosters this particular brand of irresponsibility. The colonial mind nurtures the belief that there's always somewhere else to go and exploit once the current site of extraction has been exhausted. And so now we find ourselves in a world where see, where 97% of forests are gone, 90% of grasslands, 90% of the large fish in the oceans, where a iceberg the size of Delaware just fell into the ocean off of the ice shelf, which used to be considered permanently frozen. So what does Buddhism tell us? How does it tell us how to live in the world? And that's where I want to move to the precepts here, at least briefly. So I'm going to look at the 3 resolutions and then also just read off the first 5 of the 10 cardinal precepts as a jumping off point. And this is what we take when we become Buddhists, when we maybe put on a rakusu and say, this is the path I'm going to follow. The 3 resolutions are: I resolve to avoid evil, I resolve to do good, and I resolve to liberate all beings. And the 10 cardinal precepts, and actually just the first 5, I resolve not to kill, but to cherish all life. I resolve not to take what is not given, but to respect the things of others. I resolve not to misuse sexuality, but to be caring and responsible. I resolve not to lie, but to speak the truth. I resolve not to cause others to take intoxicants, nor to do so myself, but to keep the mind clear. And so, we can approach these in the same way that we approach other questions, like what does this mean? How does this relate to my life? And it's easy to feel like we are in the clear with some of these, such as the first precept, I resolve not to kill but to cherish all life. I assume that no one here has killed anybody today. Go Sangha, we got it. We're done. But there are deeper ways to look into this. So there's lifestyle, right? Looking at things like where your clothing comes from, where your food comes from. And just as a quick aside, vegetarianism and veganism are often offered by the Buddhist community as like, this is the diet that does the least harm, and this is what we should do. And I've been a vegetarian for like 7 or 8 years, and I definitely feel that opting out of the factory farming industry is like pretty clutch if you're gonna feel morally settled in your heart. But I've come to a place where I wonder between entering relationship with an ecosystem by fishing out of a river and then doing what I can to give back to that river, is that doing more harm than buying tofu at the store that was probably grown hundreds or thousands of miles away, put to a factory that was fueled by fossil fuels, and then wrapped in a package and sent to me? I'm not saying that like I don't have the answer to that, but I think it's important to look as deeply as possible as we can at these questions. And when we start to rely on like easy fixes, that's a indicator that there's a deeper way that we can look at these things. So the 2 that really jump out to me that we can do a lot with our lifestyle is not to kill but to cherish all life. And what does that mean? And how does our lifestyle impact the lives of other beings? And then also not lying, but or actually not taking what is not given, but respecting the things of others. Just remembering, that we live in a place that was not given to us, that, indigenous cultures pretty much never voluntarily give up their land bases that they depend on for survival, and that they enter relationship into with. And so a lot of our conveniences and luxuries are at the expense of stealing from people. And how do we work with that? How do we look at that honestly? How do we enter into that with inquiry and then resolve that and choose a lifestyle and make choices that reflect honesty and compassion and connection? And then I think there's even a deeper way to to engage with this, because the problems that we face aren't going to be solved by individual lifestyle choices. We aren't going to just be better consumers and then everything is going to get better on its own. And so I would throw out there that resistance and that pushing back actively against the status quo is to me, based on my conditioning and my questioning, it is a moral imperative. It's something that we have to do. That if we are going to say that we cherish all life, then how can we not stand up to a force that is turning all life into things to be sacrificed on the altar of growth? Think about, when I was just sitting before this, it came up, the return of merit that we often do. It ends with, we place our faith in the great heart of perfect wisdom. I was just thinking of this like capitalist interpretation of it, like, we place our faith in the great heart of the free market, right? Like, it's just this and it gets into everything. I mean, when you really ask, like I keep realizing that people can own water. Like, I forget and I think that no, it's impossible. Like, no one could own water. And then it's true. There are people here in Florida who can't drink out of the water that is near them because it belongs to someone else, and then they have to go buy it back from them down the street. And how often that happens, like that we're born here and we are animals on this planet, and the planet provides shelter and food and our human communities and water and relationship. And then instead of being free to engage in those relationships and to nourish ourselves, we have to buy into a capitalist system that destroys all of those things and then sells them back to us at a premium. And we literally, at this point, because water is privatized, don't have any choice, or we're going to die of thirst. It's like, and so to me, as a Zen Buddhist, as someone who is committed to honesty and questioning and living a life that is dedicated to the sake of all beings, like, how can we not fight back against that? How can we be complacent in that system? And this isn't meant to force anyone to do anything that they're not comfortable with. I think that there are to make anyone feel guilty. The wonderful thing about living in such a screwed up time is that there is so much work to do. So, we need people willing to put, there's this great quotation from Derek Jensen, who I realize is he gets flack from all sides, but I just really appreciate that. He says, "We must put our bodies and our lives between the industrial system and life on this planet. We must start to fight back. Those who come after, who inherit whatever's left of the world once this culture has been stopped, whether through peak oil, economic collapse, ecological collapse, or the efforts of brave women and men resisting an alliance with the natural world, are going to judge us by the health of the land base, by what we leave behind. They are not going to care how you or I lived our lives. They're not going to care how hard we tried. They're not going to care whether we were nice people. They're not going to care whether we were violent or nonviolent. They're not going to care whether we grieved the murder of the planet. They're not going to care whether we were enlightened or not. They're not going to care what sort of excuses we had not to act, like, I'm too stressed to think about it, or it's too big and scary, or I'm too busy, or but those in power will kill us if we effectively act against them, or if we fight back, we run the risk of becoming like they are, or but I recycled, or any of 1,000 other excuses we've all heard too many times. They're not going to care how simply we lived. They're not going to care how pure we were in thought or action. They're not going to care if we became the change we wished to see. They're not going to care whether we voted Democrat, Republican, Green, Libertarian, or not at all. They're not going to care if we wrote really big books about it. They're not going to care whether we had compassion for the CEOs and politicians running this deathly economy. They are going to care whether they can breathe the air and drink the water. We can fantasize all we want about some great turning, but if the people, including non-human people, can't breathe, it doesn't matter. And that's a really bold statement, I know. But I agree that we've come into a time where it's not in the future, it's not later. There's a huge swath of the population right now that can't drink their water. And putting ourselves in the way of that is the calling of some people, right? Creating communities that are resilient is another piece that is going to be really necessary. We're going to need communities that don't depend on globalized, industrialized capitalism to keep going if that's what we're resisting. So I throw all of this out there as a just something to work with, something to question, something to look into. That what can we each do individually? What can we do as a spiritual community to create space for a future that is sane? Because really all of the way that we live our lives now is out of touch with actual reality, right? Like we choose not to be as honest with ourselves as we could, which creates a kind of separation that is really uncomfortable. So, as a closing, I want to share a poem by Gary Snyder, and it's hilarious, and it's meaningful, and it's very Buddhist. It's called Smokey the Bear Sutra. Once, in the Jurassic, about 150 million years ago, the great Sun Buddha in this corner of the infinite void gave a discourse to all the assembled elements and energies. To the standing beings, the walking beings, the flying beings, and the sitting beings, even the grasses, to the number of 13 billion, each one born from a seed assembled there. A discourse concerning enlightenment on the planet Earth. In some future time, there will be a continent called America. It will have great centers of power, called such as Pyramid Lake, Walden Pond, Mount Rainier, Big Sur, Everglades, and so forth, and powerful nerves and channels such as Columbia River, Mississippi River, and Grand Canyon. The human race in that era will get into troubles all over its head and practically wreck everything, in spite of its own strong, intelligent Buddha nature. The twisting strata of the great mountains and the pulsings of volcanoes are my love burning deep in the earth. My obstinate compassion is schist and basalt and granite to be mountains to bring down the rain. In that future American era, I shall enter a new form to cure the world of loveless knowledge that seeks with blind hunger, and mindless rage, eating food that will not fill it. And he showed himself in his true form of Smokey the Bear. A handsome, smoky-colored brown bear standing on his hind legs, showing that he is aroused and watchful. Bearing in his right paw the shovel that digs to the truth beneath appearances, cuts the roots of useless attachments, and flings damp sand on the fires of greed and war. His left paw in the mudra of comradely display, indicating that all creatures have the full right to live to their limits, and that of deer, rabbits, chipmunks, snakes, dandelions, and lizards all grow in the realm of the Dharma. Wearing the blue work overalls symbolic of slaves and laborers, the countless men oppressed by a civilization that claims to save but often destroys. Wearing the broad-brimmed hat of the West, symbolic of the forces that guard the wilderness, which is the natural state of the Dharma and the true path of all people on earth. All true paths lead through mountains. With a halo of smoke and flame behind, the forest fires of the Kali Yuga, which would be like the earth-ending age, right? Fires caused by the stupidity of those who think things can be gained and lost, whereas in truth, all is contained, vast and free, in the blue sky and the green earth of one mind. round-bellied to show his kind nature, and that the great earth has food enough for everyone who loves her and trusts her. Trampling underfoot wasteful freeways and needless suburbs, smashing the worms of capitalism and totalitarianism, indicating the task. His followers becoming free of cars, houses, canned food, universities, and shoes, master of the three mysteries of their own body, speech, and mind, and fearlessly chop down the rotten trees and prune out the sick limbs of this country, America, and then burn the leftover trash. Wrathful, but calm, austere, but comic, Smokey the Bear will illuminate those who would help him. But for those who would hinder or slander him, he will put them out. Thus his great mantra, Nama Samanta Vajranam Chanda Maha Roshana Svataya Hum Traka Ham Nam. I dedicate myself to the universal diamond, be this raging fury be destroyed. And he will protect those who love the woods and rivers, gods and animals, hobos and madmen, prisoners and sick people, musicians, playful women, and hopeful children. And if anyone is threatened by advertising, air pollution, television, or the police, they should chant Smokey the Bear's war spell. Drown their butts, crush their butts, drown their butts, crush their butts, which if you're not familiar with Smokey the Bear is what you do with cigarettes. And Smokey the Bear will surely appear to put the enemy out with his Vajra shovel. And now those who recite this sutra and then try it and put it into practice will accumulate merit as countless of the sands of Arizona and Nevada. They will help save the planet Earth from total oil slick. They will enter the age of harmony of person and nature. They will win the tender love and caresses of men, women, and beasts. They will always have ripened blackberries to eat and a sunny spot under a pine tree to sit. And in the end, will win highest perfect enlightenment. Thus we have heard.